Where would we be without them?
I loved your topic. Oh. You could talk to me all day about our enlister and our enlistment. And need to hear that. I was thinking when you said, I was thinking about that word we looked at yesterday, obey, which is under here. That is there's someone above you that's talking to you and you're listening. And that's the enlister. And I was thinking, obey. We're just listening to our enlister, what they have to say. A while ago, when we were all here in the room, and just 2 minutes ago, everybody almost in this room was talking. I just stood right here and I closed my eyes, and then one by one, I listened through the room and picked out individual voices and focused on them. And I could hear what you were saying, just standing here. And we live in a world full of voices, and they're all clamoring, and it's noisy. And in fact, you probably didn't even realize how noisy it was when I closed my eyes, and it was just this racket going on in this room. Okay, but I could pick your voices out, and if I focused on hearing one of you, then I could hear what you were saying over all the others, even though there were people who were louder. And that's what God has called us to do. And I started thinking about our those who are opposing us. We've been told. I've been told in the last few weeks, I need to quit the ministry. I need to leave. I need to stop teaching. By objectors. And you know what? And I realized when Martin was saying that, I can't hear you. I can't hear what you're saying. You know what I mean? I hear it obviously, but I can't hear you because there's someone louder than you. There's someone that I'm focusing. And it's not that they're louder. I'm focusing on them. So I really don't hear what you're saying. And, you got your blinders on. You just keep focusing on what God has given us to do. It reminds me of Ezra. At home we talk about Ezra a lot lately. And God gave him the job to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem after they were in bondage. They came back out and he's to rebuild the wall. And the distractors kept coming up and saying, "Come down, we want to talk to you." He's up there rebuilding the wall. He's laying the mortar and rebuilding the wall. And he can say, "Come down, we want to talk to you. Come down, we want to talk to you." He said, "I got important work to do. I can't come down and talk to you." They were distractors. We got to keep our eye on the prize. We got to keep focused with the job that we've been given to do. There's a great verse in the book of Job, in the Concordant version, and Job talks about all the days of my enlistment. When he talks about his life, he says all the days of my enlistment. Job was, man, you want to talk about a spiritual giant. It was Job. Job was such a spiritual giant that when the adversaries came before God to accuse the brethren, he picked Job. And what happened? Job went through hell in his life. He lost it all. And even down to the end, his friends came. Great friends they were. They came to encourage him. Great encouragements they were to him. And you know what his view was? Of course, we know what we many times talk about the view that, shall we receive good things at the hand of the Lord, and shall we not receive evil? He knew exactly who was doing everything in his life. But he also knew something else. He knew that every day of his life was exactly planned, and it was an enlistment. All the days of my enlistment. And when the enlistment was over, his life was going to be over. And as long as we're here, we're in the battle. That's how thank you, brother. I appreciate that. Now, I usually wake up in the middle of the night, and which ends up to be my morning. And I wake up in the middle of the night, and man, my brain is gone. And then I can't turn it off. verses are flowing through my mind. And this morning, about 3 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden verses are all flowing through my mind related to our discussion and the slide presentation that we're making. And in the process, I remembered one thing that I probably would have put in the slides. By the way, these slides are going to keep developing. Here's what you need to know. This is a work in progress, and I'm trying to compile all the information and the related topics into a very organized, systematic way, and these slide presentations are it, and this is still just part 1. 3 sessions of part 1. And we're going to post it up on the internet, and you can go there and get the slides. That way you can read the verses and study the material. And as you come back at times, the slide's going to be updated. Okay? Because this PowerPoint is going to be continually updated. And I got up this morning, and I worked for about 3 hours already revising and adding and developing a slide. I put a new one in here, so we're going to hit that real quick, and then we're going to pick up from where we left off. When I was back talking about that God created a male and female, and I was talking about how that originally Adam had both sexes and God removed and created the female, there's a couple interesting things that I realized when I woke up this morning. I realized, I didn't even mention this to you. Very simple thing. The Hebrew word for female, very important that we know this. It comes from, its root means to puncture. Literally, to perforate. That's the word for female. She has a puncture in her. Wow. That's the word for female. The Greek word for female is this, and it means nipple. To suckle, by implication, to suck. It's funny, the Hebrew focuses on the vagina, the Greek focuses on the breast. And you get the Greek and the Hebrew, and you got the two real distinctions that make the difference between a man and a woman. And that's just a slide that I wanted to bring you. In fact, the Devar version, anybody who uses the Devar version, where did I didn't even, that was on, here it is. Always forget how it translates. When the word female appears, I should have checked how female appears in the Old Testament. I forgot. But the female, when it appears in the New Testament, it's okay. How is it translated? Suckling one. I think it is. Look in Romans chapter. Let me see. I should have listened to you. So you want to use that? In fact, this verse came up earlier. Yesterday, Romans chapter, suckling one. For female, in the translation of the Devar in the New Testament, it says suckling one instead of female. The suckling one, the one who's nursing babies. To pass that back. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the very word for female in Hebrew and the very word for female in Greek is sexual and has to do with the body parts. Wow. And we get all bent out of shape if we discuss sexuality or anything sexual. Now I've got to stop here and catch up on the slides and get into the right place. We were talking about divorce. So let's find that. Hey, there's the yield sign. Putting away.
Oh, look, he's on Skype. Everybody's Skype.
Divorce. Okay, here we go. Start from here. All right. So yesterday what we did was we left off last evening, making a distinction between putting away and divorce. We made that distinction. Now we're going to come along and we looked at putting away, and now we're going to look at divorce. Divorce and religious abuse. For centuries, Christendom has done great damage by its doctrines concerning marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Great damage. Broken marriages are a deep scar. That should not be one word. Broken marriages are a deep scar on the human heart. And Christendom's self-righteous moral hypocrisy has greatly compounded its suffering, adding shame and rejection. And I say, shame on them. Evil. reason why Martin Zender's most viewed video online is the evil empire. This is an evil system Christianity is. It looks beautiful. You ride down the street, you see these beautiful structures on Sunday morning, and you see them, they'll be on opposite corners of each other, and everybody's all clean and nice and wearing their nice clothes, and they're going in, and it looks great. They look like ministers of righteousness. And Paul said, yeah, that's how the adversary works. They transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, but it's actually ministers of self-righteousness. Get me started here. Here's the religious views of divorce. According to some figures of Christendom, there is no such thing as divorce. To them, it's once married, always married. There's only one marriage partner per lifetime. I grew up with spheres of that. I used to hear that in churches and hear preachers preach that. Others say that you can only remarry if your spouse dies. Those divorced before they were a believer, all right. While others say that they're living in adultery. You ever heard anybody say people are living in adultery? You'll never read it. You'll never read anything in the Scripture says about anybody living in adultery. Adultery is an act of sin. You can't live in it. You can commit it, and then when it's committed, it's committed. No such thing as living in adultery. One may divorce for fornication, but you can't remarry. We're just going over things that religion say. In divorce, there's no innocent party. Boy, I used to know preachers say that. Everybody's guilty in divorce. There's no innocent party. Both of them are guilty. The remarried are required to do. I knew a church in Virginia Beach, and the pastor there, if you came to his church and you had been divorced, he would not allow you to be a member in that church or to attend the church unless you divorced the person you were married to and remarried the person that you were first married to. The remarried are required to divorce their current spouse and remarry their former, or remain unmarried if their first spouse had been remarried. I'm going to tell you what. You want to talk about bondage in people's lives? The law of Moses didn't even know of any kind of stuff like any of that we just read there. That's made up by the hypocrisy of Christianity. There's a great compassionate side to divorce that we need to understand. That's why it was incorporated in the law of Moses. What is not understood by religion is that there is a compassionate side of divorce. When a marriage becomes worse than divorce, marriage can become worse than divorce. And when marriage becomes worse than divorce, it's a grace of God that provides for the release from a bond that is unbearable and does not bring glory to God. The bill of divorcement. Divorce was the end of a husband-wife covenant by a written document. The bill of divorcement. I know we were going over this recently, and Clyde was just really amazed that it said there, the bill of divorcement. There was actually a document. Now, what's very interesting about this, and of course we'll read it here in the verse, but what's very interesting about that, there is no such document for the husband-wife covenant. There is no bill for the husband-wife relationship. It can be oral. In fact, we find nowhere in the Scriptures where there's no document. Okay, yes, I will be your husband, you will be my wife. Okay, let's sign right here. Nothing appears. But for the divorce, there's actually a document for that. Shows you, God not only ordained divorce in the law, He also required a document for it. Shows you how important divorce was in the mind of God. And there's a reason for that. Because a woman had a document in her hand to show that she had been released. It was a protection of her reputation. And she had it in her hand. Now, here's what it says in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 and 2. When a man has taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes. What's wrong with the situation? He don't like her anymore. Why? No favor in his eyes. Wonder how many women have found themselves in that position. Where this man that appeared to love her and adore her and care for her and dote over her, and all of a sudden he doesn't care for her anymore. She has no favor in his eyes. Because he's found some uncleanness in her. And once again, that uncleanness can't be the uncleanness of adultery or fornication. They're dealt with in other parts of the law, which was punishable by death. Then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand. This woman's not only free, but she is free beyond guilt and shame and any taint on her reputation. She's got it in her hand, and send her out of his house, and when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. That's the law of Moses. And the law of Moses is much more gracious than Christianity. Now, people say that if you're divorced and remarried, you're committing adultery. And if so, then the law of Moses granted people the permission to commit adultery, because she may go and be another man's wife. Nonsense. Ridiculous. A bill of divorcement brings an official end to the husband-wife covenant. Though an oral agreement was all that was necessary to establish the husband-wife covenant, such was not the case for divorce. A bill or written declaration of the divorce ending the covenant was required. This, by the way, this section, Deuteronomy chapter 24, where we read of divorce, this is this section of the Mosaic Law, and I'm going to quote to you here from William Luck. He's got a book about this thick on divorce. And it's called Divorce and Remarriage, Recovering the Biblical View. And I've talked to William Luck and written to him and on a number of occasions. In fact, we reprint a section of the back of that book called The Morality of Biblical Polygyny. And we publish that and make it available. But here's what he says concerning this section which this divorce appears in. From Deuteronomy 23:15 to 24:7, we find a series of legal stipulations, most of which are designed to teach the listener that people are not objects or pieces of property. Chattel slavery is degrading, and a wife is not a piece of property to be passed back and forth between husbands. So he's saying that this passage where divorce is given to teach us that people are not pieces of property. And we'll explain more about this in a minute. The underlying principle of Deuteronomy 24:1-4 is the protection from an unjust putting away. The allowance of a hard-hearted husband to divorce his wife was actually a gracious provision not for him, but for him.
Not for him, but for his wife.
All right. This is one of the things I probably write at 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay, but it wasn't a provision for him, it was a provision for his wife. Divorce released the wife from the bondage of a husband in which she had no favor in his eyes. This divorce was not for the sake of the hard-hearted husband, but for the sake of the wife who would otherwise be neglected or mistreated through passive or active abuse. God was not permitting divorce to accommodate the hard-hearted husband. It has nothing to do with his hard-hearted husband. He's a covenant breaker. He's going to be responsible for God for his mistreatment. Understand that. It's not about him. But it's to protect a wife from her husband's hard-heartedness. Treacherous putting away would have been a most miserable existence. Divorced from him, she was freed by God to become the wife of a man who would value, cherish, and provide for her. As William Luck points out, this provision is located in the part of the law which deals with the just protection of various relationships. And he will outline them. I'm quoting from him again. In each of the subdivisions, the chief purpose of the law is to protect the disadvantaged party from abuse by an advantaged one. Now, we talked about this yesterday. authority can become abusive. And the law always protects those under authority. Children, wives, servants. This is God's plan. And the divorce law is under this section of protecting people who are under authority. In 23:15 through 16, the slave is protected from his master. In the next section, children are protected from potentially abusive parents. The poor are protected from the rich in their use of usury. Wives are protected from husbands who despise them. Newlyweds are protected from military service. And innocent are protected from unjust pledges and seizure. This is all from quoting from William Luck's book. He helps us to understand the whole purpose, the whole context of this section of the law. From this interpretive list, it can be seen that the function of these laws is to define the limits of property rights and the view of protecting human beings from being considered pieces of chattel property. You know, people look at the Old Testament law and say, oh, people back there, they're like owned, and they're like, you know, they think about the bride price and all this thing. They think, oh, people back there are being sold and traded like property. And I tell you what, the law went far to protect the whole idea of this property and abuse in property. Note also that in no case is the person, now this is important, listen to this. Note that in no case is the person who the law seeks to protect guilty of anything immoral at all. If a child's being protected of his parents by their abuse, he's not immoral. If a servant's being protected from his master, they're not guilty of anything. If a wife's being protected from a husband that no longer has favor in his eyes, she's not guilty of anything immoral at all. If anything, the text seeks to identify what makes that person disadvantaged. All these people are at a disadvantage if those who have headship over them is abusing them or neglecting them. Thus, continuing the quote from Locke, thus, the text of Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, does not intend to present us with a right of the husband to divorce his wife, but rather with a discussion of how God intends to care for the wife in the face of a man who wills to unjustly put her away. The concession that releases the woman from such a man is not the only protection or even the primary protection envisioned by the law at this point, however. The woman being freed from her first husband was then able to contract a marriage covenant with another man. Now somebody says, well, what about the man? By the way, a divorce is always a decree from a husband to his wife. There's no wives divorcing their husbands. Okay? And why is that? Does a husband not need any protection? No, he really doesn't, because he's in authority. And because he's in authority, if his wife is abusive and his wife is not caring for him anymore, he doesn't need a divorce. He simply acquires another wife in addition. See, he doesn't need divorce to be freed from her. But the wife doesn't have that opportunity, and so thus we have the divorce instituted in the period of the law. Now, here's the interesting thing. Now it says, now remember what it said? It says that if a husband was no longer found, his wife no longer found favor in his eyes, he was to give her a divorce, but she may be another man's. Now notice what the next two verses say. And if the latter husband hated her. By the way, notice there's a correlation between the first husband did what? He didn't favor her. The second husband, hate her. See these words? He hates her. The second husband. The first woman didn't favor her. See the connection? And if the latter husband hate her, this woman's not doing very well. She's having a hard time, isn't she? She's got a second marriage, and now this guy hates her. And write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. And if the latter husband die, which took her, if the latter husband died, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, that is the very first husband, may not take her again to be his wife after that she is defiled, for it is an abomination before the Lord. You know what God said? God said that once a divorce decree had been given, and she had went out and married another man, and if this husband divorced her, or if he died, she could never go back and be the first man's wife again. Wow. That's interesting.
Christendom says
what is that? Yes, and thank you for saying that, because that was one of the points I was going to make. That church in Virginia Beach was actually requiring people to go against what Moses said they couldn't even do in the first place, which was go back to their original spouse. Now, why is this? It's also clear from this passage that the defilement, notice here, and this is important, a lot of people get carried away with this. The defilement is a reflection on the treacherous husband. The reason she could never go back to that husband is he had been treacherous to her. He had hated her. He had found no favor. He had mistreated her. And God's protecting that woman from ever being manipulated or seduced or somehow swayed to going back to a man who mistreated her. The law's protecting her from that abusive husband, even years later. It is also clear from this passage that the defilement is a reflection on the treacherous husband, not the wife. Just as an innocent woman who's raped is said to be defiled. The law says an innocent woman who's raped is defiled. And the issue is that man, it's a reflection on the raping man, not the woman. Just as it is in this passage, the defilement's not a reflection on her, it's a reflection on the man who did not fulfill his duties as a husband to her. Her defilement is in relationship to and is the responsibility of her covenant-breaking husband. This is why she can become another man's wife, but is prohibited from returning to the cause and source of her defilement. She was defiled by and in relationship to her hard-hearted husband, with whom she no longer found favor in his eyes. It is her former husband. Notice the verse, we've already left the verse, but the verse says former, not current. You know, another teaching is, and I should have put that on that list earlier, I just always remembering these things I didn't put down. I always heard in Christianity that if you're divorced or remarried and your first wife or your first husband's still alive, then you got two living wives. Yeah. And the fact is, they're called former in the Scripture. And her former husband must bear the stigma of defilement for his unjust divorcing of her. The defilement has no reflection on her subsequent relationship with her husband. The law, by prohibiting her from becoming her former husband's wife was, well, I hope there's more to this. Yes. It was protecting the legitimacy of the second marriage. And number two, preventing any further abuse from her former husband. The divorce, which the hard-hearted husband means for evil, God means for the good of the woman. Divorce, the end of the husband-wife covenant. Many Christians say, the Bible condemns divorce from Genesis to Revelation. I used to hear this growing up. It condemns divorce. What does the Scriptures actually have to say about divorce? Oh, okay, these are all out of whack here. Regardless of what religionists assert, to the contrary, divorce is the end of a marriage. Otherwise, it would be a separation and not a divorce. Divorce prohibited. There are only two situations mentioned in the Bible in which a man could not divorce his wife. You know, when the Scriptures say, okay, you can't divorce your wife, and he gives you two specific reasons, then you know that divorce is not restricted on the others. They were both under the law of Moses. The first one was that if a man slandered his wife concerning her virginity, the right of divorce was lost according to the law. If a man slandered his wife, listen, this shows that abuse goes way beyond. Steve was asking us the other day whether, okay, it looks like you do everything right from the, there's no physical abuse. But here, if a man abused his wife, that is, he slandered her concerning her virginity, he could never divorce her. He loses that option. He's going to have to take care of her for the rest of his life. Number two, if a man forced an unengaged woman, still under the headship of her father, to lie with him, he was to marry her if her father permitted him and never divorce her. So there's actually two penalties. The penalty, non-divorce was actually a penalty. Two examples. These are indeed strange penalties if they already apply to everyone. These passages are totally meaningless if divorce was forbidden across the board in all cases, as some religionists would have us believe. Divorce through the Scriptures. Since some believe that the Bible condemns divorce from Genesis to Revelation, let's look through the Bible and see what the Bible really has to say concerning divorce. By the way, there's no reference to divorce in the book of Genesis. In Exodus, a neglected wife may leave her husband. A neglected wife may leave her husband. One should take special notice about how divorce is regulated by the law while the practice was taken for granted. Although this book is filled... I copied this out of my book. That's why I said that. No, it's talking about Exodus. Although this book is filled with rules and regulations, there is nothing at all prohibiting divorce and remarriage in the book of Exodus. In Leviticus, it says that a priest was not to marry a divorced woman. It's the only thing that we know there. Much is often made of this passage, but it should also be noted that they were forbidden to marry widows too. It's important to recognize that these rules apply only to the priest and not to everyone. There is nothing at all prohibiting divorce and remarriage in the book of Leviticus. Numbers 30 verse 9 lists the divorced women right along with the widows in the same class. And why? Why would a divorced woman be listed with widows? Because they are both without it. They have both lost their husbands and they are both without support. And not with the outcast and abominable of Israel. There is nothing at all in the book of Numbers prohibiting divorce and remarriage. Now, understand, when we say divorce and remarriage, we understand we're using that in Christian's phrase. We could also say divorce and the reestablishment of a husband and wife covenant. Deuteronomy. A man who divorces his wife was to let her go and be another man's wife. The reason for the divorce, according to this passage, was that there was no favor and some uncleanness. These could not have been supposed sexual impurities because they were dealt with by death, not divorce. And there's the two laws for adultery and fornication. It should be noted that according to 24, 1 through 4, which we've already read, God demanded and recognized divorce papers. In fact, God so recognizes the divorce and remarriage that the former mates are forbidden to remarry, although that is actually what some counsel people to do: divorce their present mate and remarry their former. The simple fact is that they are not, as some would say, still married in the sight of God. There is nothing in Deuteronomy prohibiting divorce and remarriage. Jeremiah. Although divorce can be the result of sin, not all divorce is sinful. The reason we know this is Jeremiah 3:8 says that God divorced his wife, and the sin here was the part of Israel's. I plan to write a book one day called God is Divorced Too. A book of comfort. You said you're shamed and disgraced because you're divorced. Well, God's also divorced. This is indeed a strange thing for God to do if it was forbidden for anyone to put away his wife for any cause. Should have put divorce there. Some folks would have a hard time recognizing the fact that God is a divorcee. Where does this leave the no innocent party doctrine? So God's guilty also, huh? Malachi, the a religious legalist will often quote Malachi chapter 2 verse 16. This is probably the religionist's favorite verse when it comes to divorce. For the Lord, the God of Israel, says He hates putting away. God hates divorce. They'll read that verse and then they're going to tell you about how much God hates divorce. What they fail to recognize is the context of this statement was treacherous putting away. Israel had forsaken their wives and married daughters of strange gods. What happened is they had married, a trend had happened in Israel. And they had married, when they were young, they had married Israelites. And then, as they got older, they went out and started getting heathen women and marrying them, and then putting away their Israelite wives. Oh, was God, and God said, I hate this. Along these lines, it is also interesting to note that Matthew 1:19 tells us that Joseph was minded to put away his wife. Joseph was going to put away his wife. He wasn't going to divorce her. He was going to put her away. Why would he have done that? By the way, and I don't know if you've noticed, all through this talk, I've talked to you about the fact that the putting away that God hated and that God made the law for divorce for was treacherous putting away. It is possible to put away a wife and take good care of her and to love her, but to put her away and from having relationships with her. And this is what Joseph was mindful to do. Why was he mindful to do it? Because when he first realized what was going on, he thought that there was fornication involved. And instead of the great love he had for Mary, instead of humiliating her, I mean, after all, she's pregnant, going to have a child, and he hasn't even had intercourse with her yet. And so, being a just man, instead of publicly humiliating her, for this sin, which the law would have required her to be put to death, Israel later became lenient on that and ended up making the penalty for those sins to be divorce in their practice. And instead, he was just going to put her away and take care of her and keep this thing hush-hush. He had that much love for her. Mary, his wife Mary, while at the same time being called a just man. The four Gospels, Jesus Christ's teaching is in harmony with that of the Old Covenant, the Hebrew Scriptures. He did not come to destroy it. He condemns treacherous putting away, as with Malachi, misunderstanding and mistranslation confuses the issue of putting away with divorce. John chapter 4, verses 16 through 18, Jesus said unto her, "Go, call your husband, and come here." You remember this story. This is Jesus with the woman at the well. Jesus was at the woman at the well at noontime, and the woman of disrespect was there. And he sits and talks to her, and he says to her, "Go call your husband and come here." And the woman answered and said, "I have no husband." And Jesus said unto her, "You have well said, I have no husbands, for you have had 5 husbands, and he whom you now have is not your husband." Notice how Jesus understood all these things we've already been teaching all weekend. This woman's living with a man, and she knew the truth. They didn't have a covenant, and she was just living with him. And Jesus said, "Go get your husband." And she said, "I don't have one." And Jesus said, "You're right, you don't have one. And that he whom you now have is not your husband." So there's no covenant. But they're having a sexual relationship. And now notice what he also says at the beginning of it. "You have well said, I have no husbands, for you have had 5 husbands. All past." Listen, a divorce decree ends a marriage relationship. What we hear Christianity say is she has 5 living husbands, and Jesus Christ agrees. He agrees with the Old Testament teaching of the covenant of husband and wife and of the bill of divorcement.
Click.
Our battery died? We'll check that out. Huh? It's working out? Oh, okay. Okay, now what we're doing, we're working our way through Scriptures, Romans. And Romans chapter 7 is usually a key passage used by those who promote the religious doctrine of once married, always married. This passage has nothing to do with divorce. We're not going to read through the passage, but you'll have the notes so you can go back and read for yourself. This passage has nothing to do with divorce. There is no divorce mentioned in the entire passage. Funny that folks will take you to Romans 7, a passage to condemn divorce that never even mentions divorce. In fact, that is exactly the problem. There had been no divorce papers given. The woman, while married, marries another. It should be remembered that this passage is written to those who keep the law, who know the law. One can't understand this passage unless they first understand what was taught in the law of Moses. 1 Corinthians, oh wow. Okay, I got to practice up on this slide business. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. The widows and the unmarried can marry. And by the way, a divorced person is unmarried, according to verse 11. Husbands and wives should not be separated from each other. Wives who separate should await reconciliation. There is no marital bondage for one whose unbelieving spouse leaves them. The whole point of marriage is that God has called us to peace. This is the key. Believers should not seek divorce. Divorce is not something that should be sought. That's a clear teaching from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. No question about it. The loosed passage where it says, seek not to be loosed. Loose is a reference to divorce. Loosed from the marriage. There are only two things that could loose the bonds of marriage, or the husband-wife relationship. Would have been the more proper way to say that. Death and divorce. The loose in this verse cannot mean death, for obviously one shouldn't try to kill their mate. So the issue there was divorce. 1 Timothy chapter 4, Paul says that forbidding to marry is a doctrine not of Paul, but of devils. Forbidding to marry. Christianity is really good at forbidding to marry. And forbidden to have husbands and wives too. But it didn't say that. It said married. Forbidding to marry is a doctrine of devils. Uh-oh.
That's just about having sex, isn't it?
It is. Mm-hmm. Yes. God said that this was not good, and that it was not good that man should be alone. Now suppose that Eve had left Adam for some other man. Of course there wasn't any, but that's why we're supposing. Could some evil that Eve did change that which was good for Adam? Does God have a system whereby the divorced must live in celibacy? That is a religious doctrine, not a doctrine of God. If you marry, you have not sinned. Interesting, huh? Now, porneia. Now, this is going to be the question that comes up. Then what sexual sins are not lawful? 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, the King James says, flee fornication. The word is porneia. Now, I put all these translations because they all translate in different ways. Flee fornication, the Bible in basic English says, keep away from the desires of the flesh. The God's Word translation says, stay away from sexual sins. Holloman Christian Standard says, run from sexual immorality. The Concordance says, flee prostitution, from prostitution. Definition. What is this definition of this word porneia? It's unlawful sexual intercourse. That's the definition in Strong's Concordance, and that's the definition in that concordant keyword concordance. Unlawful sexual intercourse. Porneia is sexual intercourse that was not permitted under the Mosaic law. Sexual restrictions. Now, we did a teaching on this when we were in Seneca Falls. Things I didn't learn in Sunday school. And we went over... Is my timer still working? What time is it?
11.
It's what?
11.
Okay. Sexual restrictions. We looked at in Leviticus chapter 18 provides a simple list of those that you could not have sex with. Now, why do we bring this up? Because porneia. Paul says avoid porneia. What is it? Any sexual activity that was unlawful. What does Moses say? Who does Moses say you can't have sex with? Moses says you can't have sex with your father, can't have sex with your mother, can't have sex with your wife, your father's wife. I thought your father's wife was your mother. Oh, he must have more wives. Okay, got that. Okay, can't have sex with your sister, can't have sex with your granddaughter, can't have sex with your aunt, can't have sex with your uncle, with your daughter-in-law, your sister-in-law, with a woman and her daughter. A woman and her daughter. Oh, she could have sex with more than one person at a time, just can't be a woman and her daughter. Isn't that awful? Wow, that's interesting. A woman and her granddaughter. A wife's rival sister. You could marry a woman and her sister, but they can't be rivals. That's always smart. Okay. And a neighbor's wife.
Who's your neighbor?
And a male as a woman. Or an animal. That's the end of the list, by the way. Those on this list are there because of their relationship to the potential sexual partner. These all have some relationship to you that God forbids you from having a sexual relationship with. The list deals with individuals with which one was prohibited from having sex. If someone was not found on the list, they were eligible for sexual relations. Don't take a lot of brain power to figure this out. Very simple. Here's the list. Don't do these. Okay. This passage deals purely with the individuals involved in the sexual activity and not with specific wrongdoing committed against such individuals. In other words, you could have sex with anybody not on that list if the conditions were right. For instance, force is prohibited. Just because somebody's not on that list doesn't mean you can force them to have sex with you. Understand what I'm saying? Just because someone was not on the list of excluded individuals does not mean that they were free to be forced to have sex against their will. So therefore, there is a Mosaic law against rape. Rape was a sexual crime punishable by death.
Question. What about the forced of where she's still under the headship of her father?
Forced rape is punishable by death.
No.
If she consents, that's another issue. If a woman who is unbetrothed, there was already a slide for
I
that.
had a question about that because, and then you were to marry her if the father permitted.
Yes.
What if
It wasn't a force. She agreed to it. It was consensual sex. She was a party to it. So it's not this issue. This is an issue of rape here. Yeah. That's not
I thought there was a word in that sentence that you could say that she wasn't agreeing.
Yeah, this is this verse. This is this passage in Deuteronomy 22:25. And it also involves sex with children is also included under the principle of the law of rape, under the Mosaic law, in a similar way that our laws also have statutory rape. The Mosaic law was very simple in its structure. Remarkably, it only encompassed 613 commandments. One had to cross-reference these laws to find the principles for dealing with specific circumstances. Otherwise, the law of Moses could have taken up as much space as the entire Scriptures now. Rape would have included sexual violation of children as they were spoken of under the law of Moses as your little ones, which you said should be a prey, and your children, which in that day had no knowledge of good and evil. Sex used for the worship of false god was prohibited. So, even though somebody's not on that list, if you're having sex with them to worship a false god, then that's prohibited. Leviticus chapter... There's the timer.
Keep going.
Okay. Leviticus 19 and Leviticus 32 says, "Do not profane your daughter to make her a cult prostitute, that the land may not prostitute itself and the land be full of lewdness. There shall come to be neither a cult prostitute from the daughters of Israel, nor shall there come to be a cult prostitute from the sons of Israel." So, there's another area of sexual relationships that was prohibited in the Old Testament. What we need to understand is that the religions that were around Israel and the other nations, they used sex to worship. And they would have temples, and you would go in and you would meet up with women and have sex with them to worship God. In fact, in Corinth, the temple there in Corinth, and it's important to understand this, to understand what's going on at Corinth. We're told historically that they had about 1,000 cult prostitutes that worked at the temple. And when you'd go in to worship the false gods, you would have sex with these women to worship the false gods. And God said you can't use sex to worship other gods. I'm the one who made it. You'd be worshiping me, not the false gods. So the definition of terms. And here, we're going to go through these really quickly here. English. Now, I'm working on a book, also going to work on a dictionary of sexual, marital, and family terms. And I'm going to have English definitions, and then I'm going to have Greek and Hebrew ones. So far, I've just started the English ones to any sufficient use in this context. So here they are. An abbey, for instance. We're just talking about English words. Not that they necessarily even appear in Scripture. An abbey is an estate of a family under father rule. That is patriarchy. Betrothed means to enter into a husband-wife covenant. Bride price is a prepaid alimony equal to 1 year's wages given by the groom to her father, to the father of the bride for investment. A concubine is a slave acquired for various services, including sexual. A coverture is the place of protection and care of a woman under the authority of her head, her husband, or her father. Cultic prostitute is temple prostitutes who provided erotic and sexual services in the worship of a pagan god. Divorce is the end of a husband-wife covenant by a written document. Dowry is a wedding present given to the bride by her father. Due benevolence is a euphemism for conjugal duty or sexual intercourse. Espousement is the state or condition of being husband and wife. Elders are male members of the patriarchal family, grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Family is an extended, multi-generational, deep, multilateral, aunts and uncles, including those attached to it, such as servants. The modern concept of the family as being nuclear, a man and wife and his children, is not a concept that the Bible knows anything about as a family. The firstborn is the oldest son who took over the patriarchal position of leadership upon the death of his father. Fornication, Concordant uses the word prostitution, is intercourse that was not permitted under the Mosaic law. Hospitality is the use of a household as a ministry to those outside the family. Household is the smallest family unit living within the same dwelling. A husband was a man under covenant responsibility to a wife, a woman's man, a household head. No is a euphemism for sexual intercourse. License is permission to do what would otherwise be illegal. Marriage is the state of sexual intercourse. Marry is the act of sexual intercourse. Monogamy is having only one spouse. One flesh is a euphemism for sexual intercourse. Patriarch is a family head. Polygamy is having more than one spouse. Polygyny is having more than one wife. Premarital sex, you tell me what that is. It's pre-sex sex. I don't know. Maybe it's foreplay. Prostitute is a woman who provides erotic or sexual service for pay. Now we're just talking about the way English works. Now Concordant uses this word to translate porneia, but porneia is unlawful sexual intercourse. Putting away is a common ancient practice of setting aside a wife, hard-hearted spousal abuse. Separation is sexual abstinence in the husband-wife relationship. It's an unmarried state. We already talked before. You can be husband and wife and not be married. That can be before, and it can be early on. It can be later on too. Single, a person not in a husband-wife covenant. Submission, yielding to the authority and mission of another. Unmarried, not in a state of sexual intercourse. Wed, to engage in sexual intercourse. Wedding, a feast celebration celebrating the marriage of the husband and wife. Wife, a woman under covenant responsibility of submission to a husband. A man under covenant responsibility to a wife as a woman, a man's woman. Now here's a question, and I throw this in at the end because we're done. There are many, 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 many more hours to deal with this subject. But someone's going to hear this talk in its unfinished state and said, "Oh, you're just saying we should go out there and have sex with everyone." No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about reading the Scriptures and seeing what the Scriptures have to say. We're reporting what the Scriptures say. So I said, is there a higher standard than the Mosaic Law? Yeah. Steve gave it to us yesterday, didn't he? It's love. Love. Whatever we do in our lives should be, as Steve, be a great place for your message right here. Filtered through the filter of love. Whatever we do. Not only that, but expediency. Paul said, all things are lawful to me. All things are lawful to me. But not all things are expedient. Just because someone's not on a list, don't mean you should be going out and getting everybody who wasn't on the list. Because not everything's very expedient. Are there not consequences to our actions, even if legitimate? Take, for instance, the drinking alcoholic beverages is a legitimate biblical practice. Should you enjoy a few and then get behind the wheel of a car and ride down the road? You understand what we're saying? We're talking about things that are expedient. Come on. We're trying to teach the Bible here. We're not trying to teach. People think because I teach this that I'm teaching for people to misbehave and be stupid. Yes, the Bible does say you reap what you sow. And there is venereal disease, and there is pregnancy, and there's all kinds of things. You need to be smart. You need to be expedient about your choices. You need to do whatever you do, you need to do it to the glory of God. And can sex be done to the glory of God? Absolutely. Can loving somebody and caring for somebody be done to the glory of God? Absolutely. And then there's also the principle of, somebody said, well, are there no consequences for your actions? Absolutely. And Paul says about marriage and such a trouble in the flesh. About marriage. You know what Paul said? If you get married, you're going to have trouble. Yes, there are consequences to your actions. But I tell you what, there's a lot of benefits too. And you have to weigh them. Should I be married? Should I have a husband? Should I have a wife? These are all decisions that we make out of love and out of expediency and to the glory of God. All right, we're done.